Sometimes the job that saves your life is the one nobody else is willing to take. On a cold November morning in Hartford, Connecticut, Naomi Carter stared at the eviction notice lying on her small kitchen table and wondered how many more disappointments one person could survive before becoming numb to them. The paper sat beside an unpaid electric bill, 2 overdue credit card statements, and a nearly empty coffee mug. Outside her apartment window, gray clouds covered the sky while a steady rain tapped softly against the glass. Naomi folded the notice carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. She had exactly 14 days before she would lose the apartment she had called home for nearly 6 years. At 33 years old, she never imagined life would look like this. 2 years earlier, her husband passed away after a long illness. The medical expenses consumed most of their savings. The months that followed brought one setback after another. Jobs disappeared. Rent increased. Opportunities became harder to find. Through it all, Naomi kept moving forward because she did not know how to do anything else. Yet lately, even her determination felt exhausted. That morning she opened her laptop and searched job listings for the 3rd time before noon. Most positions paid too little. Others required experience she did not have. A few never responded at all. Just as she prepared to close the screen, one listing caught her attention. Private care assistant needed. Live-in position. Competitive salary. Full benefits. She clicked immediately. The position involved caring for Alexander Reed, a 41-year-old technology entrepreneur who lived on a private estate outside Hartford. Following a serious accident several years earlier, he required daily assistance. The salary was more money than Naomi had earned in the past 3 years combined. At first she assumed there must be a mistake. Then she noticed another detail. High turnover position. Applicants must be prepared for a challenging work environment. Naomi almost laughed. A challenging environment sounded far less frightening than homelessness. 2 days later, she found herself standing outside the gates of Reed Manor. The estate stretched across several acres of rolling hills and bare autumn trees. Iron gates guarded the entrance. Beyond them stood a massive stone mansion overlooking a small lake. Everything about the property suggested wealth, success, and power. Yet despite its beauty, the estate felt strangely empty. Quiet in a way that seemed intentional. A housekeeper greeted Naomi at the front entrance and escorted her inside. The interior looked elegant but cold. Large windows overlooked the water. Expensive artwork decorated the walls. A grand piano stood in the corner of the living room. Yet something felt missing. The house resembled a museum more than a home. As they walked through the hallway, Naomi noticed framed photographs placed on several shelves. Most featured Alexander at business events, charity functions, and company celebrations. In every image, he appeared confident and successful. Then the housekeeper stopped outside a closed door. Her expression became cautious. "Before you go in," she said quietly, "there is something you should know." Naomi nodded. "What is it?" The woman hesitated. "You are the 9th caregiver this year." Naomi blinked. "The 9th?" The housekeeper nodded. "Nobody stays long." Before Naomi could ask why, the door opened from inside. The room beyond was spacious and filled with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Near the window sat a man in a wheelchair staring at the water. His dark sweater contrasted against the pale November sky outside. He looked younger than Naomi expected. Stronger too. Yet there was something distant about him. Something closed off. Slowly, he turned toward the doorway. His blue eyes settled on her for only a second before shifting away. "Another one?" he asked flatly. The housekeeper cleared her throat. "This is Naomi Carter." Alexander looked back toward the lake. "She will not last." The words were not angry, not cruel. They sounded worse than that. They sounded certain. Standing in the doorway of the most beautiful house she had ever entered, Naomi suddenly understood why nobody stayed. But as she glanced at the eviction notice folded inside her purse, she also understood something Alexander Reed did not. She had already run out of places to go. Naomi's first week at Reed Manor felt longer than an entire month. Each morning began before sunrise. She helped coordinate medications, organize schedules, prepared meals, and assisted with the countless small details that kept the household functioning smoothly. The work itself was not difficult. The challenge was Alexander Reed. He seemed determined to convince everyone around him that caring about him was a waste of time. He rarely said thank you. He avoided conversation whenever possible. Most days he spent hours positioned beside the enormous window overlooking the lake, staring across the gray water as though waiting for something that would never return. Naomi quickly understood why 8 caregivers had left before her. Yet she also noticed something none of them seemed to mention. Beneath Alexander's cold exterior was not anger. It was exhaustion. One rainy afternoon, Naomi entered the library carrying a tray with coffee and lunch. Alexander sat near the fireplace reviewing documents on a tablet. Without looking up, he said, "Leave it there." Naomi placed the tray on a nearby table but remained standing. "You skipped breakfast." Alexander continued reading. "I was not hungry. You skipped dinner yesterday too." Finally, he looked up. His expression was sharp. "Are you always this persistent?" Naomi folded her arms. "Only when someone is making my job harder than necessary." For a second, silence filled the room. Then something unexpected happened. The corner of Alexander's mouth almost moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to surprise both of them. "You sound different from the others." Naomi shrugged. Maybe the others were smarter. The almost smile disappeared, but she noticed it had existed. That small moment stayed with her throughout the day. Later that evening, while organizing files in the home office, Naomi spoke with Margaret, the housekeeper who had worked at Reed Manor for more than 15 years. "Was he always like this?" Naomi asked quietly. Margaret glanced toward the closed office door. "No." She hesitated before continuing. Before the accident, Alexander filled every room he entered. He traveled constantly, hosted charity events, built companies. He had plans for everything. Naomi listened carefully. And afterward, Margaret sighed. Afterward, he stopped believing there was a future worth planning. Those words lingered in Naomi's thoughts. Over the following days, she began noticing details throughout the mansion. A dust-covered piano in the music room, unopened invitations stacked on a desk, family photographs tucked into drawers instead of displayed on shelves. The entire estate felt frozen in time, as though life had stopped moving forward years earlier. One afternoon, Naomi wheeled Alexander onto a covered terrace overlooking the lake. Autumn leaves drifted across the water while cold wind rattled nearby trees. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Alexander broke the silence. "You know you can leave." Naomi looked at him. "What?" "Most people do." He stared toward the lake. "They stay a few weeks, sometimes a month. Then they decide I am not worth the effort." The statement was delivered so calmly, it almost sounded factual rather than emotional. Naomi leaned against the railing. "Maybe they left because they never understood you." Alexander laughed bitterly. "Trust me, there is not much to understand." Naomi studied his face. For the first time, she saw something beyond the distance and frustration. Loneliness. The kind that grows slowly over years until it becomes part of a person's identity. She recognized it because she had lived with it herself. "You might be wrong about that," she said softly. Alexander looked at her for a long moment before turning back toward the lake. Neither spoke again. But as the wind moved across the water and evening settled over the estate, Naomi sensed something had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice. Yet somewhere behind the walls Alexander Reed had built around himself, a door had opened just a fraction. And unlike the 8 caregivers before her, Naomi had no intention of walking away from it. By the 3rd week, Naomi realized something unusual. Alexander Reed was testing her. Not openly, not through rude comments or impossible demands. His tests were quieter than that. He would ask for assistance and then insist he no longer needed it. He would begin a conversation only to shut it down moments later. Some days he seemed almost willing to let another person into his world. The next day he would retreat behind walls so thick they felt impossible to cross. At first Naomi found the behavior frustrating. Then she began understanding it. Alexander was not trying to push her away because he disliked her. He was trying to discover whether she would leave like everyone else. One cold December morning, Naomi arrived in the dining room, carrying breakfast. To her surprise, Alexander was already there reviewing financial reports on his tablet. A large window overlooked the frozen lake beyond the estate. Sunlight reflected across the ice, filling the room with pale winter light. Naomi placed the tray in front of him. "You are up early." Alexander glanced at her briefly. "Conference call. At 7 in the morning?" "The company has offices in 3 countries." Naomi shook her head. "That sounds exhausting." "It is." The answer came without hesitation. For a moment, She noticed genuine fatigue behind his eyes. Not physical exhaustion, something deeper, the kind that accumulated over years. As the days passed, small changes continued appearing. Alexander started spending more time outside his private office. He occasionally joined the staff for lunch. Once, Naomi even caught him listening while Margaret told a story about her grandchildren. He never admitted enjoying the conversation, but he did not leave either. The mansion itself seemed to respond to the shift. Rooms that once felt silent began feeling lived in again. One afternoon, Naomi discovered the piano in the music room had been opened for the first time in years. Curious, she entered and found Alexander sitting nearby. "Do you play?" she asked. He looked toward the instrument. "I used to." Naomi walked closer. "What happened?" Alexander smiled faintly. "Life." The answer carried more meaning than the single word suggested. Later that evening, while organizing books in the library, Naomi noticed a framed photograph tucked between several volumes on a shelf. The image showed Alexander standing beside a group of employees at what appeared to be a company celebration. Everyone in the photograph smiled. Alexander smiled too. The difference shocked her. She had never seen that version of him before. He looked lighter, hopeful, alive. When she returned the photograph to its place, she found herself wondering what had happened to that man. A few days later, a snowstorm swept across Connecticut. Heavy flakes covered the estate from morning until night. Most of the staff left early to avoid dangerous roads, leaving only Naomi, Margaret, and Alexander inside the mansion. By evening, power flickered several times before finally stabilizing. The storm transformed Reed Manor into an isolated island surrounded by white silence. Naomi spent part of the evening in the kitchen preparing soup while listening to the wind outside. Unexpectedly, Alexander entered the room. "Margaret said you cook." Naomi looked up. "Sometimes. Smells better than anything the chef makes." She laughed. "Do not tell him that." To her surprise, Alexander laughed too. An actual laugh. Short and quiet, but real. The sound seemed so unexpected that both of them paused afterward. Then something remarkable happened. Alexander smiled. Fully this time. For only a second, but long enough for Naomi to see it clearly. The expression transformed his face. Suddenly she understood why people once followed him so easily. Why investors trusted him. Why employees admired him. The smile revealed the man hidden beneath years of disappointment. Alexander noticed her staring and immediately looked away. "What?" Naomi shook her head. "Nothing." But it was not nothing. Because for the first time since arriving at Reed Manor, she had seen proof that the person everyone described as cold and unreachable still existed somewhere inside him. And as snow continued falling beyond the windows, Naomi realized she no longer stayed because she needed a paycheck. She stayed because she wanted to help him find his way back. December settled fully over Reed Manor, bringing shorter days, colder nights, and long stretches of quiet snowfall that transformed the estate into a world of white and silver. The frozen lake reflected pale winter sunlight during the day and moonlight after dark. Inside the mansion, however, something warmer had begun taking shape. It happened so gradually that neither Naomi nor Alexander noticed at first. Yet Margaret certainly did. One afternoon, while arranging fresh flowers in the dining room, she smiled to herself as she watched Alexander and Naomi argue over a crossword puzzle. The disagreement was entirely harmless. Alexander insisted one answer was incorrect. Naomi refused to admit defeat. 5 minutes later, both were laughing. It was the kind of ordinary moment Reed Manor had not seen in years. The mansion no longer felt frozen in time. It felt alive again. One morning, Naomi entered the library expecting to find Alexander staring out the window as usual. Instead, she found him reviewing plans for a new charitable foundation his company once supported. Several folders lay spread across a large table. "What is all this?" she asked. Alexander glanced up. "Something I should have paid attention to a long time ago." Naomi stepped closer. The foundation provided scholarships for students from low-income families. Many programs had been reduced after his accident. "You started this?" she asked. Alexander nodded. "Years ago." His voice softened. "Then I stopped caring about almost everything." Naomi looked through the documents. Hundreds of students had benefited from the program. Some attended colleges they otherwise could never afford. Reading their letters of gratitude filled the room with quiet emotion. "You changed a lot of lives," she said. Alexander stared at one of the letters for a moment before replying. Not enough. That answer revealed something Naomi had begun understanding. Beneath his wealth and success existed a man carrying enormous disappointment in himself. Not because of his physical limitations, because he believed he had abandoned the person he once wanted to become. Later that week, another snowstorm arrived. By evening, thick flakes drifted across the estate, while strong winds swept through the trees surrounding the mansion. Naomi finished organizing medications and headed toward the kitchen. As she passed the music room, she heard something unexpected. Piano notes. She stopped immediately. The melody was simple and slow, but unmistakably beautiful. Carefully, she stepped closer to the doorway. Alexander sat beside the piano. His hands moved confidently across the keys. For several minutes, Naomi remained silent, listening. The music carried a sadness that seemed impossible to describe. Yet there was hope hidden inside it as well. Eventually, Alexander noticed her reflection in the piano's polished surface and stopped playing. "I did not know you played," Naomi said quietly. He looked down at the keys. "Most people here do not. Why did you stop?" Alexander smiled faintly. "Because someone was listening." Naomi laughed softly. "That seems like a terrible reason." For a moment, he considered her response. Then he returned his hands to the keyboard. The music began again. This time, Naomi sat nearby and listened openly. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Some conversations happened without words. As the final notes faded into silence, Naomi realized she had witnessed something important. Alexander had shared a piece of himself that he rarely allowed anyone to see. Trust was beginning to replace isolation. A few days later, while decorating the mansion for Christmas, Naomi found herself standing on a ladder hanging ornaments across a large tree in the main hall. Alexander watched from nearby. "You missed a spot," he said. Naomi looked down. "You are enjoying this entirely too much." "Possibly." She shook her head and reached for another ornament. Suddenly, the ladder shifted slightly. Before Naomi could react, Alexander instinctively moved forward. The action was small, but it spoke volumes. Without thinking, he had tried to help. Naomi steadied herself and smiled. "I am okay." Alexander relaxed. For a brief second, their eyes met. Neither looked away immediately. The moment passed quickly, but something remained afterward. Not romance. Not yet. Something deeper. The recognition that two lonely people had slowly become important to each other. And neither one was quite ready to admit how much. Christmas arrived beneath a blanket of fresh snow, covering Reed Manor in a quiet beauty that seemed almost unreal. White drifts lined the pathways. Frost shimmered across the frozen lake. Warm golden light spilled from the mansion windows into the winter darkness. For the first time in years, the estate looked like a home preparing for a holiday rather than a monument to loneliness. Naomi noticed the difference everywhere she went. Staff members smiled more often. Music played softly through the hallways. Even Margaret seemed lighter. Yet the biggest change remained Alexander. Although he would never admit it, he had become more engaged with the world around him than at any point since Naomi arrived. Christmas morning began earlier than usual. Naomi walked downstairs expecting the house to be quiet. Instead, she found Alexander already in the main hall beside the large Christmas tree they had decorated together days earlier. Several wrapped boxes sat beneath its branches. The sight surprised her. "I thought you said you did not celebrate Christmas anymore," she said. Alexander glanced toward the tree. "I said I stopped enjoying it." Naomi smiled. "That sounds suspiciously different." For a moment, he almost argued. Then he shook his head and laughed softly. It was becoming easier for him to laugh. Easier to smile. Easier to exist without constantly carrying the weight of old disappointments. Later that afternoon, Reed Manor hosted a small holiday gathering for staff members and several families connected to the Scholarship Foundation. Children filled the mansion with energy and excitement. Laughter echoed through rooms that had spent years sitting silent. Naomi spent most of the afternoon helping serve food and organize activities. At one point, she glanced across the room and noticed Alexander surrounded by 3 children asking endless questions about technology and business. To her surprise, he appeared completely engaged in the conversation. The children laughed at something he said. Moments later, Alexander laughed too. Watching him, Naomi felt an unexpected warmth settle in her chest. This was the man hidden beneath the walls. The version of Alexander Reed that had almost disappeared. As evening approached, guests gradually departed. Snow continued falling outside, creating a peaceful silence across the estate. Naomi helped clean the dining room while Margaret finished organizing leftovers. Eventually, only Naomi and Alexander remained in the main hall. Christmas lights reflected softly off ornaments hanging from the tree. For a while, neither spoke. The quiet felt comfortable, familiar. Then Alexander wheeled himself toward a nearby table and picked up a small wrapped package. "This is for you." Naomi blinked. "You got me a gift?" Apparently, Christmas requires these things. She laughed and accepted the package. Carefully, she removed the paper. Inside rested a leather-bound journal. Elegant but simple, the kind of item chosen with thought rather than expense. Naomi ran her fingers across the cover. "It is beautiful." Alexander looked toward the tree instead of directly at her. "You always write notes, lists, ideas. I thought maybe you needed somewhere to keep them." The gift touched her more deeply than he realized, because it meant he paid attention. He noticed details, small things most people overlooked. "Thank you," she said softly. For several seconds, neither moved. Snow drifted beyond the windows while Christmas lights cast warm reflections across the room. Then Naomi asked a question that had quietly lived in her thoughts for weeks. "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" Alexander understood immediately. She was not asking about Christmas. She was asking about everything. The accident, the years afterward, the life he lost. He considered the question carefully. Every day, his answer was honest, painfully honest. Then he looked at her. But lately, not quite as much. Naomi felt her heart tighten unexpectedly. She knew what he meant. The months since arriving at Reed Manor had changed both of them. Neither one had planned for it. Neither one had expected it. Yet somehow, two people carrying separate loneliness had begun creating something neither possessed alone. As the fire crackled softly in the nearby fireplace and Christmas night settled over the estate, Naomi realized she no longer thought of Reed Manor as a temporary job. It had become part of her life. And without fully meaning to, Alexander Reed had become part of it too. The week after Christmas brought a calm stillness to Reed Manor. Snow remained piled along the edges of the estate, covering gardens and pathways beneath layers of white. The holiday decorations still filled the mansion with warmth, but January waited quietly on the horizon. For Naomi, life had settled into a rhythm she never expected. Mornings began with coffee and schedules. Afternoons passed through conversations, meetings, and quiet moments beside the lake. Somewhere along the way, the mansion had stopped feeling temporary. It felt familiar. One afternoon, while organizing documents in Alexander's private study, Naomi searched for a file requested by his financial advisor. The study was one of the few rooms she rarely entered alone. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls. Large windows overlooked the frozen lake. Everything remained orderly, almost untouched. As she searched through a cabinet drawer, her hand brushed against a small wooden box hidden beneath several folders. She hesitated. The box was old, its corners worn from years of use. It looked personal. Naomi immediately intended to place it back. Then she noticed something. A photograph partially visible beneath the lid. The image caught her attention because the woman in the picture looked familiar. Slowly, she opened the box. Inside rested several photographs, letters, and a silver bracelet. Naomi picked up the top photograph. Her breath caught instantly. The woman smiling beside Alexander looked almost identical to her. Not exactly the same, but close enough to feel startling. Similar eyes, similar smile, similar features. Confused, Naomi studied the picture more carefully. The photograph appeared old, taken years before the accident. The woman stood beside Alexander on a beach at sunset. Both looked genuinely happy. Before Naomi could examine anything else, a voice spoke from behind her. "You were not supposed to find that." She turned immediately. Alexander sat in the doorway. His expression was calm, but something vulnerable lingered behind it. Naomi carefully returned the photograph to the box. "I am sorry." Alexander wheeled himself farther into the room. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt different than usual, heavier somehow, more personal. Finally, Naomi looked toward the box. Who was she? Alexander stared at the photographs for a long moment before answering. Her name was Claire. Even speaking the name seemed difficult. Naomi listened quietly. "We were engaged." The words settled heavily between them. Suddenly, many things began making sense. The loneliness, the distance, the grief hidden beneath years of isolation. Alexander lowered his eyes toward the bracelet inside the box. The accident happened 3 months before our wedding. Naomi remained silent. She sensed there was more. Much more. Alexander continued. Everyone assumed losing the ability to walk was the hardest part. He smiled sadly. It was not. His voice softened. Claire left 6 months later. The room became completely still. Naomi felt her heart ache. Not because Claire left, because she finally understood the depth of the wound Alexander carried. It was never only about the accident. It was about abandonment. About watching the future he planned disappear piece by piece. About believing the person who promised to stay could not. Alexander looked toward the frozen lake beyond the window. I do not blame her anymore. The statement sounded practiced, as though he repeated it many times. Yet Naomi sensed some pain never completely disappears. Do you still love her? She asked gently. Alexander considered the question. For a long time he said nothing. Finally, he shook his head. No. Then he added something that surprised even him. I think I miss who I was when she loved me. The honesty of the answer filled the room. Naomi understood immediately. Sometimes people do not mourn relationships. They mourn the version of themselves that existed before loss changed everything. As evening sunlight reflected across the snow outside, neither person spoke for several moments. Then Alexander looked directly at her. Do you know what is strange? Naomi waited. His eyes briefly shifted toward the photograph before returning to her face. The first day you walked into Reed Manor, I thought I was imagining things. Naomi frowned slightly. Alexander smiled faintly. Because for 1 second, you reminded me of someone I thought I would never stop missing. The confession lingered in the quiet room, and neither of them realized that the truth hidden inside that wooden box was only the beginning of a far more heartbreaking story. The discovery of Claire's photograph stayed with Naomi long after she left the study. Over the next several days, she found herself noticing details she had previously overlooked. Certain songs seemed to affect Alexander differently. Specific dates on the calendar caused him to become quieter. Some evenings he would spend hours staring across the frozen lake with a distant expression that suggested he was somewhere far beyond Reed Manor. The more Naomi understood his past, the more she realized his loneliness had never been caused by one loss. It was the accumulation of many. Yet despite the emotional weight of their conversation, something else had changed as well. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Alexander no longer seemed afraid to let her see the parts of himself he usually hid. One snowy evening in early January, Naomi entered the library carrying tea and found him reading through an old leather folder. The moment he noticed her, he hesitated before handing it over. You should probably see this. Surprised, Naomi accepted the folder and opened it carefully. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some were handwritten. Others were printed emails. Most came from former friends, business partners, and colleagues. Many were dated within the first year after Alexander's accident. Naomi skimmed several pages. At first the messages sounded supportive, encouraging, full of promises to visit or stay in touch. Then the letters gradually stopped. The later pages became fewer and fewer until there were none at all. Naomi looked up slowly. What happened? Alexander smiled without humor. Life moved on. The answer sounded simple, but she understood the deeper meaning. People had promised they would remain. Then one by one they disappeared. Not out of cruelty. Sometimes simply because tragedy made them uncomfortable. Sometimes because their own lives became busy. Sometimes because they assumed someone else would stay. Eventually, almost nobody did. Naomi closed the folder gently. Her heart ached for him. That must have been difficult. Alexander looked toward the fireplace. It taught me something. She waited. People love the version of you that makes them feel comfortable. His voice remained calm. Very few stay when everything changes. The words lingered heavily between them. Naomi wanted to disagree. Yet part of her understood exactly what he meant. Loss had taught her similar lessons after her husband's death. Certain friends disappeared. Phone calls stopped. Invitations faded. Grief often revealed which relationships were real. A few days later, another surprise arrived. While reviewing household schedules, Margaret informed Naomi that a visitor planned to arrive at Reed Manor the following afternoon. The announcement immediately caught Alexander's attention. Who? He asked. Margaret hesitated. Claire. The room fell silent. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. Alexander said nothing at first. His expression remained unreadable. Finally, he nodded once. All right. That was all. No anger. No excitement. No visible emotion. Yet throughout the rest of the day, something felt different. He spoke less. Worked less. Smiled not at all. The following afternoon, snow drifted gently across the estate as a dark sedan pulled into the circular driveway. Naomi happened to be standing near the front entrance when the woman stepped out. Instantly, she understood why the photograph startled her. Claire resembled her far more than coincidence should allow. Similar height, similar features, similar warmth in her eyes. Yet there was also a sadness about her, the kind carried by someone who lived with regret for a very long time. Inside the mansion, Claire and Alexander faced one another for the first time in years. Neither moved immediately. Neither spoke. The silence itself felt emotional. Finally, Claire offered a small smile. "Hello, Alex." Alexander looked at her calmly. "It has been a long time." What followed surprised Naomi completely. There was no dramatic confrontation. No bitterness. Only two people quietly acknowledging the pain they once shared. As the conversation continued, Claire eventually revealed the real reason she came. She was sick. Not critically, but seriously enough to force her to reconsider unfinished chapters in her life. Before leaving, she wanted to apologize. Not for ending their engagement. For disappearing afterward. Tears filled her eyes as she spoke. "You deserved better than silence." Alexander remained quiet for several moments. Then, with remarkable gentleness, he nodded. "Maybe we both did." Watching from a distance, Naomi felt something inside her chest tighten, because she suddenly realized the heartbreaking twist hidden beneath this story. Claire had never been the great love Alexander still wanted. She was the grief he never finished releasing. And until that moment, neither of them truly understood the difference. After Claire's visit, a quiet transformation settled over Reed Manor. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. The snow still covered the grounds. The frozen lake still reflected the pale winter sky. The mansion remained as elegant and peaceful as ever. Yet something invisible had shifted. For the first time in years, Alexander seemed lighter. Not happier exactly. Lighter. As though he had finally set down a burden he carried for far too long. Naomi noticed it almost immediately. He spent less time staring out windows and more time engaging with the world around him. He attended meetings he once avoided. He reopened plans for the Scholarship Foundation. He even began discussing future projects with a level of enthusiasm that had been absent since she arrived. One afternoon, while reviewing proposals in the library, Alexander suddenly looked up from his laptop. "I want to expand the program." Naomi glanced at him. "The Scholarship Foundation?" He nodded. "There are hundreds of students on waiting lists." Naomi smiled. "That sounds like a good problem to solve." For a moment, Alexander simply looked at her. Then he smiled. "You know something?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "That usually means trouble." He laughed quietly. "You have a talent for making impossible things seem manageable." The compliment caught her off guard. More than that, it touched something she had not realized she needed. For years, Naomi's life had revolved around surviving. Paying bills. Handling loss. Enduring uncertainty. Very few people had looked at her and seen strength instead of struggle. Yet Alexander did. The realization stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Days passed, then weeks. January slowly moved toward February. Reed Manor no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a place where two wounded lives had begun healing side by side. Yet despite everything that had changed, one important truth remained unspoken. Both of them felt it. Neither knew how to say it. One snowy evening, Naomi sat alone in the music room writing in the journal Alexander had given her for Christmas. The fire crackled softly nearby. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the darkness beyond the windows. She heard the sound of wheels approaching and looked up. Alexander entered quietly. "I thought I might find you here." Naomi smiled. "I could say the same thing." He positioned himself near the piano. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt familiar, comfortable. Then Alexander surprised her. "Claire called yesterday." Naomi closed the journal gently. "How is she?" "Better." He nodded thoughtfully. "She thanked me." Naomi waited. Alexander looked toward the fire. "She said she was glad I found happiness again." The words hung in the room. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken unexpectedly. Alexander continued before she could respond. "The strange thing is that I did not know what she meant at first." His eyes lifted toward hers. Then I realized she was talking about you. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter. Naomi looked away briefly, not because she wanted to, because emotions she had carefully controlled for months suddenly became impossible to ignore. Alexander took a slow breath. When you arrived here, I thought you would leave. His voice remained calm, but deeply sincere. Then I hoped you would stay. Naomi listened silently. Every word mattered. Now, he continued softly, I cannot imagine this place without you. Emotion filled the space between them. Not dramatic, not rushed, just honest. Naomi felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming realization that someone finally saw her exactly as she was and chose her anyway. She stood slowly and walked toward him. Do you know what I was afraid of? She asked. Alexander shook his head. Naomi smiled through the emotion. I was afraid I only mattered because I reminded you of someone else. Alexander immediately understood. Without hesitation, he shook his head. No. His voice was certain. You helped me let go of someone else. The answer carried a truth neither could deny. Claire represented the past. Naomi represented the future. And as snow continued falling softly beyond the mansion windows, both finally understood that the choice standing before them was not about fear anymore. It was about whether they were brave enough to accept the happiness waiting right in front of them. February arrived with brighter mornings and slightly warmer afternoons. The snow still covered much of the estate, but signs of change had begun appearing. Icicles melted beneath midday sunlight. Small patches of grass emerged along the edges of pathways. The frozen lake no longer looked endless and still. Winter was slowly releasing its hold on the world. Inside Reed Manor, another season was ending as well. The loneliness that once defined every room had quietly disappeared. In its place stood something neither Naomi nor Alexander had expected when their paths first crossed months earlier. Peace. The days following their conversation in the music room felt different. Nothing became dramatic. Neither rushed to label what existed between them. Instead, they continued building the same foundation that had carried them this far. Trust, respect, friendship. Yet now those things were accompanied by something deeper. An understanding that both had stopped facing life alone. One Saturday morning, Alexander invited Naomi to join him during a meeting with the Scholarship Foundation Board. At first she refused. She insisted she was not qualified. Alexander disagreed immediately. By the end of the meeting, several board members were discussing ideas Naomi suggested for expanding educational opportunities in underserved communities. As they left the conference room, Alexander smiled. You realize they liked your proposal more than mine. Naomi laughed. That seems unlikely. It happened. For a moment, they simply stood together in the hallway smiling. The simplicity of the moment felt surprisingly meaningful, because happiness no longer arrived through extraordinary events. It appeared through ordinary ones. Several weeks later, Reed Manor hosted a celebration for the scholarship program. Students, families, educators, and community leaders gathered inside the mansion. The house buzzed with conversation and laughter. Looking around the room, Naomi barely recognized the estate compared to the place she entered months earlier. The cold silence was gone. Life had returned. During the event, one student approached Alexander and thanked him for helping make college possible. The young woman spoke with such sincerity that emotion briefly crossed his face. After she walked away, Naomi noticed him staring toward the crowd thoughtfully. What are you thinking about? She asked. Alexander smiled. How close I came to giving up on all of this. His eyes moved across the room. I almost convinced myself nothing I did mattered anymore. Naomi looked at him carefully. But it does matter. He nodded. Then he added quietly, you reminded me of that. The words stayed with her long after the event ended. A few days later, near the beginning of March, Alexander asked Naomi to join him beside the lake. The afternoon sky was clear. Sunlight reflected across the partially thawed water. Birds had begun returning to the trees surrounding the estate. Spring waited just beyond the horizon. They sat together overlooking the lake where so many conversations had begun. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Alexander reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. Naomi looked at him curiously. What is that? He smiled. The eviction notice you carried in your purse the first day we met. Her eyes widened in surprise. How did you know about that? Alexander laughed softly. Margaret accidentally told me months ago. Naomi shook her head. Of course she did. Carefully, he handed the paper to her. The edges had become worn over time. You arrived here because you were out of options. Naomi looked down at the notice. It felt like something from another lifetime. Alexander's voice softened. I spent months believing you saved my life. She immediately opened her mouth to disagree. He gently stopped her. Then I realized something. Naomi waited. Alexander looked toward the lake before meeting her eyes again. You did. Emotion filled the silence between them. The kind that did not need grand speeches. The kind built through patience, consistency, and time. Naomi felt tears form despite her smile. You saved mine too. The answer came naturally because it was true. As the afternoon sunlight shimmered across the water, Alexander reached for her hand. Naomi intertwined her fingers with his without hesitation. Together, they watched the lake slowly awaken from winter. Months earlier, a desperate woman accepted a job because she had nowhere else to go. A lonely millionaire hired another caregiver he assumed would leave. Neither could have imagined what would follow. Yet sometimes the most beautiful twists in life are not found in tragedy or fortune. Sometimes they are found in two wounded hearts discovering that home was never a place at all. It was each other.